Story 1. Kuk Kai Kai was a famous prison built in our region of Thailand for political dissidents a few generations ago. The first floor was for housing the prisoners. The second floor was a large and crowded chicken farm. The second floor had a grated floor, ensuring that the droppings of the chickens fell upon the prisoners continuously. Apparently, even some of the officers escorting prisoners to the prison would vomit upon getting near, even with masks on. A week in there was the maximum sentence, which was enough to break anybody. Story 2. The company town where my grandmother grew up in West Virginia had this system in the 1940s where they paid workers in company currency instead of real money. When the mine shut down, everyone's savings became worthless overnight. Hundreds of families lost everything. It's barely mentioned in our local history books. Story 3. The Haymarket Riot and almost everything surrounding the establishment of the 8-hour workday and 40-hour week rule in the United States. People just do not understand how much blood was spilled so that we can have a weekend. Story 4. The Vipe Home Experiments. They started as tests to see how you can prevent tooth decay, then transitioned to seeing what caused tooth decay, then trying to cause tooth decay while seeing if they could reduce the risk of tooth decay. They did this in a mental institution on patients with severe mental health problems and ran the experiment for 4 years. Story 5. Under the Pinochet regime in Chile, there was Ingrid Olderock, the woman of the dogs. She was a high-ranking member of the Chilean secret police who trained a squad of officers to train dogs, specifically German Shepherds, to torture political prisoners. I watched a gritty documentary about it at an independent film festival made by people familiar with the regime, and the most horrifying scene was that of a young socialist protester who was arrested and thrown in a jail cell. She did her best to keep her resolve until the door opened and she saw agents with 8 German Shepherds on leashes. Her face fell, and she started crying. She knew that she would spend the next few days being sexually violated, scratched, bitten, and more, all without any mercy. Story 6. In the early 1980s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis-tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries did not have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. Story 7. The business plot, also called the Wall Street Putsch and the White House Putsch, was a political conspiracy in 1933 in the United States to overthrow the government of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and install Smedley Butler as dictator. Butler, a retired Marine Corps Major General, testified under oath that wealthy businessmen were plotting to create a fascist veterans organization with him as its leader and use it in a coup d'etat to overthrow Roosevelt. Roosevelt's election was upsetting for many conservative businessmen of the time, as his campaign promise that the government would provide jobs for all the unemployed had the reverse effect of creating a new wave of unemployment by businessmen frightened by fears of socialism and reckless government spending. Some writers have said concerns over the gold standard were also involved. Jules Archer, in the plot to seize the White House, wrote that with the end of the gold standard, conservative financiers were horrified. They viewed a currency not solidly backed by gold as inflationary, undermining both private and business fortunes and leading to national bankruptcy. Roosevelt was damned as a socialist or communist out to destroy private enterprise by sapping the gold backing of wealth in order to subsidize the poor. Story 8. In the United Kingdom, Theresa May, as Home Secretary, was pushing for a mass surveillance program and was advocating for the Snoopers Charter Communications Data Bill. In 2012 and 2013, Edward Snowden revealed to the world the existence of Tempora in 2013, but it had been pilot tested and developed since 2008, becoming fully operational in 2011. This means one of two things: the government developed mass surveillance without the knowledge of citizens, and then May tried to get approval for it after the fact, or the government communications headquarters made Tempora without the full extent of the government, given the Home Secretary was not aware and advocating for something that already existed, which speaks to the power of the government communications headquarters. Story 9. Colony Hospital of Barbacena, Brazil. To summarize, it was a psychiatric hospital known as the Brazilian Holocaust. Basically, if you were sent there, it would be similar to going to a death camp. The conditions there were subhuman, with shock therapy, torture, or just dying from cold and hunger. The worst part? 70% of the people there did not have mental disorders and were either prostitutes, homosexuals, political enemies, or similar. In addition to this, they trafficked the bodies of those who died there. Story 10. There was a rebellion in 1962. The Libertarian Party wanted to overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic. In response, the Sultan declared the country in a state of emergency, turning it from a constitutional monarchy to an absolute monarchy, granting himself absolute power without having to go through parliament. The revolt failed after a few days, but the Sultan has kept renewing the state of emergency every 2 years to this day, keeping his godlike authoritarian powers. Our school history books just skim over this event while books detailing the revolt are confiscated by the Internal Security Department. Story 11. I don't know if this qualifies for the question completely, but North Korean people were abducting Japanese people off the streets from the years 1977 to 1983 to make them spies for the North Korean government. It was a conspiracy theory for a very long time until it was finally found out that it was true. Story 12. Vlakplaas was a secret farm in South Africa run by a state-sanctioned torturer and murderer by the name of Eugene de Kock during the apartheid years. He is serving a life sentence, but the politicians who supported him and who knew what he was doing on their behalf never paid a price. Story 13. For 10 years, I worked at a place called Dog Rocks Wildlife Sanctuary. There's a crop of granite rocks there, named Dog Rocks. When I was a kid, my mom would take me there to explore and play. We were told that it was called Dog Rocks because a pack of wild dogs used to live there. But the truth was it was a sacred site for the Wathaurong people, and they'd camp there quite often. In the 1830s and 1840s, the place was being rapidly settled by English colonials. These people had huge hunting dogs. One night, they set them loose on the people there. The dogs ripped them apart, including women and children. This was told to me by an elder who I spoke with about some of the native plants and things. He had to tell me very quietly, in a hushed voice. Not quietly enough. The group I was with had an old boomer farmer with us, who overheard and got extremely angry and abusive when he heard that story and had a go at the elder, who went very quiet and didn't speak at all after that. Turns out it was true and they'd done this all around the area, and hushed it up for fear of getting in trouble with the government and the Aboriginal Protectorate people. There was also a suburb in the nearby town called Bell Post Hill. Not many people know where the name came from. In the early days of settlement, there was a bell on a post on a hill that would be rung when the local indigenous tribes would attack. But the truth was, they'd ring the bell to gather the settlers who would then set out into the neighboring hills and massacre the local tribes. Most white descendants of these settlers have no idea. Most modern people don't care or have any idea what happened in that area and how widespread and insanely vicious the violence was. Streets, roads, and parks are named after people who did unspeakable things. Sometimes there's a feeling about certain places that somehow things aren't right. It's weird. Story 14. The Musket Wars in New Zealand, where warring Maori tribes sought to settle historic grudges and went on a killing spree. It's estimated that 2/3 of all Maori were killed. Story 15. I sometimes wonder how much people in my country, Canada, know about the World War II Japanese-Canadian concentration camps that occurred in Canada. I learned about them by reading a book for my English project in school. Story 16. In Eastern Europe after World War II, there was significant retaliation against former German soldiers who never quite made their way back to Germany. Some would dispute the severity of this fact as they often deserved punishment. Some soldiers stayed for years because they knew they would be caught if they tried to go back, only to be discovered years later. This lasted well into the 1960s in some places. My grandfather lived in a small Polish town and was familiar with one such case. For former German soldiers who played prominent roles in the regime were discovered long after the war. The laws at the time could not punish them, but there was an understanding that civilians would get a group together to ensure justice was served, and the law would turn a blind eye as long as they weren't killed or maimed. In this particular instance, my grandfather was called as one of 30 to 40 civilians in the town to witness the justice being served. One of the Germans was set free with 10 lashes, as he was young at the time. The other 3 were sentenced to ride the cow. They were taken to a dairy barn, each made to sit atop a cow facing backwards, head dangling off the end. arms tied behind their backs, and legs tied to posts on each side. Then their faces were shoved up to the cow's rear until the nose made contact and tied in position, and left to spend the night with the cow. 2 of the soldiers got 2 days, and the last soldier got 4 days. My grandfather said it was the most horrific thing he'd ever witnessed, but he still wasn't sure he felt bad for them. Story 17. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. Story 18, old story, and I'm sure plenty of people know about it, but I honestly learned about it 2 years ago and was floored. So, in the south of France, there was a Catholic sect called the Cathars, who were very non-hierarchical and had no formal clergy. They were accepted by the local lords and were a real part of the social fabric. In the early 1100s, the church decided this was not acceptable, so they pressured the French king to start a crusade against his own subjects. It was called the Albigensian Crusade, as much of this movement was centered around Albi. It was massacre upon massacre for 2 centuries before the last Cathar was burned at the stake. Whole cities were razed because it was nearly impossible to purge the heresy from the local population. What surprises me is that a city 20 minutes from my hometown, where I used to hang out as a kid and a teen, was burnt to the ground during this crusade, and I never once heard about it, in school or otherwise. Even my parents were pretty surprised when I told them. Story 19. The early destruction of electric vehicles in that documentary was depressing. They confiscated perfectly functional electric cars just to destroy them. This was the early 2000s. Story 20. There was this incident in the 80s where an entire psychiatric facility was caught using patients as test subjects for experimental drugs. My mom was a nurse at a nearby hospital and said the whistleblower mysteriously disappeared after reporting it. You will not find much about it online. It is like it never happened. Story 21. In the United States, 2 boys were murdered on train tracks. The investigation into their deaths was odd and puzzling at alarmingly high ranks. Witnesses were killed, and medical reports were illegitimate. This was not the work of a gang. On that day, the Central Intelligence Agency was protecting a drug trade operation that was part of a broader program of using drug money made in trade across Latin America to fund a proxy war in Latin America and Cuba, selling out American lives for the supposed greater good of installing pro-American democracies. An American interest, but not of the American people. Story 22. There was an unsuccessful September 11th event in my country before the September 11th attacks. Seriously, it happened around the 1980s. A father had hijacked Viacao area Sao Paulo Flight 375 and shot one of the pilots in order for him to fly into the president's office. Apparently, the main reason he did this was simply because he hated the president, if I remember correctly. In order to stop the hijacker, the plane performed an acrobatic maneuver to knock him down. Here comes the crazy part. They found newspapers of this event in Osama bin Laden's hideout, meaning it wasn't a pure coincidence that the September 11th attacks happened 20 years later. Story 23. Unit 731 in Japan. It was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that engaged in lethal human experimentation and biological weapons manufacturing during the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to 1945, and World War II. Between 1936 and 1945, roughly 14,000 people were murdered. At least 300,000 people died due to infectious illnesses caused by the activities of Unit 731 and its affiliated research facilities. It routinely conducted tests on people who were dehumanized and internally referred to as logs. Victims were further dehumanized by being confined in facilities referred to as log cabins. Experiments included disease injections, controlled dehydration, biological weapons testing, hypobaric pressure chamber testing, vivisection, organ harvesting, amputation, and standard weapons testing. Victims included not only kidnapped men, women, including pregnant women, and children, but also babies born from the systemic rape perpetrated by the staff inside the compound. All prisoners within the compound were killed to conceal evidence, and there were no documented survivors. Story 24. The Holodomor of 1932 to 1933 was a man-made famine in Ukraine orchestrated by the Soviet regime. Due to harsh collectivization, requisition of grain and other foodstuffs from peasants, and restrictions on movement, millions of Ukrainians died from hunger. This tragic event is considered a genocide of the Ukrainian people, aimed at suppressing national identity and resistance to the authorities. The Holodomor was long hidden in the Soviet Union, but after its collapse, it became widely discussed, and Ukraine recognized it as genocide. Story 25. My mom worked as a nurse in Tennessee during the 1960s, and she recently told me about something called the Mississippi appendectomy. They would perform unnecessary hysterectomies on black women without telling them. She quit her job at that hospital when she found out. I can't believe this isn't taught in schools.